Hi everyone. In this video I'm going to talk a little bit about sociobiology, what it is, and evolutionary psychology and what it is, as well as kind of their perspective on personality and personality traits. So we should probably start by defining what sociobiology and evolutionary psychology are. Sociobiology, think of it as kind of a large umbrella. It's kind of a larger field that kind of looks at the relationship between evolution and behavior. Um, it draws from different fields. It's not just a field of study in biology. It draws from different fields such as biology, also includes anthropology, sociology, psychology, as well as some other fields of study. Okay. So think of kind of sociobiology, like I said, as kind of a large umbrella, kind of large field, and evolutionary psychology is kind of a subset of sociobiology. And evolutionary psychology, what evolutionary psychologists essentially try to do or attempt to do is they're trying to study and determine how certain psychological characteristics, so in the case of our class, we're maybe talking about personality traits, but it could be things like intelligence, it could be things like um, psychological disorders, so on and so forth. They're trying to figure out and determine how those characteristics or certain behaviors and traits have developed through the process of essentially natural selection, which I'll talk more about in just a minute. All right, so in order to really kind of understand evolutionary psychology and sociobiology in terms of how they think about personality and personality traits, it's important to start with some basic concepts. And these aren't described in the assigned reading, but I want you to understand them. Because they really are kind of important to understand, especially when you're trying to understand not just the evolutionary theories, but also kind of the trait theories of personality in general. So I'm guessing most of you have probably heard these terms before if you've taken a biology course. But when we talk about genetics and talk about really kind of evolution, natural selection, there's two key terms to be aware of. The first is this thing called genotype. And the genotype really refers to an individual's or an animal's genetic inheritance. It's the genes that you inherited specifically, okay? So if we were to look at your DNA, right, to look at all the genes that you inherited, that would be your genotype, whereas your sibling's genotype would be different. It would share some similarities to yours, but it would be different, just like your parents would be different, your friends would be different, probably your friend might be very different than your own, okay? So that's the genes that you inherit, and you can't change that at all. Okay, your genotype is passed down to as soon as your parents procreate and create you, as soon as you're conceived, that's what you get, right? The genotype. The phenotype, though, is the expression of your traits, the expression of your genotype. So just because you have a certain genotype doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a certain way. Right? And the phenotype is largely the result of the interaction between your genes and your environment. So an example of this is if you think of identical twins, while identical twins oftentimes look alike, for example, they may not, oftentimes any identical twins I've known, there have been some things that you could tell that differentiated them in terms of physical characteristics. Some identical twins I've known actually look quite different from each other. Even though they have the same exact genotype, their phenotype is different, and that's the result of their interaction with the environment. So it may be due to things like maybe they look different because of maybe their diets were different, right? Or maybe one of them in high school started smoking, the other didn't, right? Or one was more active, the other wasn't active, those sorts of things, right? So that can affect how they might look. When we talk about psychological characteristics, we believe that a basic assumption of these theories is that psychological characteristics have a genetic basis to them, right? So that we inherit genes that influence certain characteristics, including personality traits, but it doesn't completely determine who we are, right? Those personality traits are expressed differently based on our interaction with our environment, with society and culture, right? And that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about phenotype. Another important thing to understand is this idea of what's called the reaction range. I've also heard it referred to as like the range of formation, a couple other different things. But the reaction range is essentially understanding that any trait, be it physical characteristic such as height or a psychological characteristic such as introversion or intelligence or something like that exist along a continuum from low to high. Okay, so to give you a very basic physical example to kind of illustrate this, think about height, right? Height has a range of possibilities for humans. So, you know, some of the shortest humans are probably around 3 feet, maybe a little less than that, right? So let's put like 3 feet down at the low end. The tallest humans, I think the tallest person like on record is a bit over 8 feet or something like that. So it's say like 8 feet here, okay? Most people are kind of in between this, right? Most people are kind of between like 5 and 6 feet, okay? Um, Kind of think of that bell curve, if you will, if you're familiar with the bell curve. So most people are between 5 and 6 feet, okay? But depending on your genotype, you may gravitate more toward the lower end or the higher end, okay? So I'm not very tall. I'm kind of low average, so I'm kind of in here, right? But some people, like I have an uncle who's very, very tall. He's like 6'5", right? Whereas I have my mom, she's on a good day around 5 feet, okay? Um, so they probably inherited, and this is actually my mom's twin brother, obviously not identical, but her twin brother is 6'5", she's about 5 feet tall. My mom got a different genotype than my uncle did, right? My uncle inherited genes that predisposed him toward being tall. My mom got ones that predisposed her toward being short, right? And the key thing to understand is that no matter what sort of experiences my mother had, she was probably never going to be a tall female, right? Regardless of how healthy she had lived and how well my grandparents raised her and so on and so forth, she was never going to be a tall person, right? So essentially, her genotype put a restriction on the range of possibilities for her, right? So depending on her life experiences, my mom might have been somewhere between, let's just say hypothetically, 4'10" and 5'2" to 5'3", right? Whereas my uncle inherited genes that predisposed him toward height, right? So like I said, my uncle, her twin brother, is 6'5". He was never going to be short. Didn't matter what happened to him. He could have been sickly as a child and all of that. He was probably never going to be short. Now, he might not have turned out to be 6'5", if he had had different experiences, a different diet, different health, all that sort of stuff when he was younger. Maybe he would have been more like 5'11", 6 feet tall. But he was never going to be short, right? And we believe the same applies to, at least if you buy into genetic theories and kind of evolutionary theories, we believe there's a range of possibilities, range of expressions of personality traits and other psychological characteristics based on the genes that you inherit, right? So to give you an example of that, if we think about the personality characteristic of introversion, right? On the low end of this is what we would call kind of high introversion. On the high end, on the high end of that, we'd say this is very extreme introversion. On the low end of that, we'd say it's low introversion, or what we might call extroversion, right? So someone might genetically inherit a tendency toward introversion. I tend to be very highly introverted. Anyone who knows me well knows I'm an extreme introvert. You can ask my parents. I've always been introverted. While I'm a little less so than I was when I was younger, I've always been introverted, and it would not matter what my family did, what sort of experiences I had. I was probably never going to be over here. I was probably never going to be an extrovert. My wife and my daughter, on the other hand, are pretty extreme extroverts. It makes for an interesting house sometimes. They're extreme extroverts, right? And it doesn't matter what sort of things I've learned in raising my daughter. It doesn't matter what we do. My daughter is never going to be introverted, right? So there's a range of possibilities. She might be a little less extroverted depending on what happens to her across her life, but she's never going to be over here. And similarly, based on my life experiences, I might be a little less introverted, but I'm never going to be all the way over here. Okay. So let me explain a couple other key points before we get into really kind of bringing this all together and discussing kind of how personality traits are believed to be linked to evolution. So I want to briefly explain this concept of instincts, right? Instincts are these things that are kind of programmed into us, right? Genetically kind of programmed into us. So if you think, for example, if you have a dog or a cat, right? Oftentimes after animals go to the bathroom, for example, they will scratch at the dirt to cover it up. I have a cat that does that. We got him when he was very young. He was actually found in a box somewhere with his siblings, so he didn't have a mom really to raise him for very long. Uh, his mother probably never taught him to do that. It was probably hardwired into him, right? Similarly, my dog does the same thing. If she goes to the bathroom, she kicks up her legs and scratches and all of that. And it's a thing, what I've learned for dogs is to kick up their scent, right? So that other animals are aware that they're around and kind of mark their territory. It's not something I ever taught her to do. It's not something her mother probably did. She was a rescue dog as well and was taken from her mother very young. It's something that's probably genetically programmed into her. And if you know animals, if you're an animal person, you've probably realized there are certain things that are just embedded in animals genetically that they just know to do, or most of them know to do, because it's kind of like a computer program. It's programmed into them based on their genes, right? And these instincts can either be assertive, they can be instincts to kind of assert your own needs, or they can be the sort of instincts that are needed to take care of others, right? But the key thing is to understand there are some things in animals that are programmed into them. And sociobiologists and evolutionary psychologists believe similarly, humans also have some things that are instinct to them. Freud believed this, right? Many psychologists have believed this over the years, that there are things that are just instinctual to us that have been essentially the result of the process of evolution, although it wasn't kind of explained that way in a lot of other theories. Okay. This brings us to the idea of natural selection and the idea of sexual dimorphism and sexual selection. If you've learned about the theory of evolution or natural selection, essentially Darwin's theory of natural selection essentially says that certain traits and characteristics, certain instincts as well, fit better with certain environments than others. Right? And over the course of history, some of those traits and some of those instincts have evolved in men and women, males versus females, right? This has led to sexual dimorphism. And at some point, what ends up happening is females of a species, including humans, start to desire certain characteristics and certain traits in males, and vice versa, right? And this leads to attraction, right? And what a female values and finds attractive in one environment, be it an animal or be it a human, uh, may differ in a different environment, right? So, for example, what females in the U.S. might find attractive, at least for heterosexual females, what they might find attractive in males may differ in China or parts of Africa or so on and so forth, right? At least based on this belief about natural selection, and it has to do with kind of what is needed to survive in that environment, what sort of characteristics you might be important to pass on to one's offspring, right? And what ends up happening is this idea of sexual selection, that through procreation and through attraction, all that sort of stuff, and then having kids, what ends up happening is there becomes this selection that through mating, certain traits and characteristics are selected. And because they're seen as desirable, and those traits and characteristics are oftentimes passed on through one's genotype to future generations. And other traits and characteristics that aren't seen as attractive eventually become selected out in the environment. So let's bring this all together. So from the perspective of sociobiology and evolutionary psychology, psychological characteristics, and in the case of this class, we're talking about personality traits. Those traits and behaviors are seen as the result or as being developed through the process of natural selection. Right? And they come to believe that certain traits, again, let's say personality traits for the case of this particular class, are more suitable to certain social environments. Right? Certain personality traits help one to survive more and thrive in that environment than others, right? They help the person to be more successful in a particular social environment. So an example of this might be, think about, for example, like aggression. Right? Some people are more aggressive than others. And sociobiologists and evolutionary psychologists might say maybe you see aggressiveness in humans more so in certain parts of the world, in certain environments, if you will, certain social or cultural groups. Aggression might be normalized, all this sort of things. Violence might be more normalized because there's more competition for resources or things of that sort. right? Whereas in certain environments where there's less competition for resources, maybe the environment is abundant with resources, there's no competition really over those, and so therefore people who are aggressive in those sorts of environments are seen are kind of cast out, right? They don't really fit in with the environment. In fact, they behave in a way that's opposite to what is needed in that environment. So over the course of evolution, eventually aggression gets selected out for that particular environment, where it becomes selected in to an environment where there may be more stiff competition for resources. Similarly, things like introversion or extroversion. Evolutionary psychologists might believe an explanation for why we see differences in introversion and extroversion may have to do with how those characteristics fit in certain environments. So if you look at some research, there's certain parts of the world where people tend to be generally more introverted than extroverted and vice versa. So in the United States, the research tends to show most Americans, depends on the research you look at, but most Americans tend to be extroverts, right? Uh, and the reason for that, or at least from a evolutionary psychological perspective, might be that in order to fit in into American culture, you have to be more introverted, right? Or sorry, more extroverted, because you have to kind of be willing to put yourself out there and compete with other people and all of those sorts of things, right? In some other parts of the world, so many Asian cultures, individuals are oftentimes more introverted, right? And that might be because introversion is valued more in Asian parts of the world, where there's less stiff competition. You're actually working together. You're encouraged to kind of be thoughtful and those sorts of things, right? Um, Not that extroverts can't be thoughtful, but the point being you're encouraged to maybe be more introspective than an extrovert might be. Okay. The key thing I want you to understand is different environments might need different things out of people depending on what's valued socially, as well as kind of what the physical environment demands. Okay, and as a result, evolutionary psychologists believe essentially as a result of this, over the course of human history, certain personality traits and characteristics have been either selected out or selected in. Uh, and therefore become more prominent in certain cultures and certain social groups, certain environments, and those sorts of things. And that accounts for some of the diversity we see in terms of personality traits and characteristics, and why or people from one part of the world, that personality-wise might tend to be different or very different from people from other parts of the world, because the environment demanded certain things out of them that another environment didn't. All right, I hope the sociobiology and evolutionary psychology makes sense. Certainly, if you have any questions, don't be afraid to reach out.